it if, a lot of people, I know you mentioned this might be kind of your first step into cybersecurity. This might be, the first time you've been exposed to these things. That's completely fine. We've all kind of been there. And I think one of my favorite things about these competitions is you are going to bring in a lot of new, creative, unbiased ways of looking at these problems. So it's also really exciting just to kind of see and run a lot of this through a new, fresh pair of eyes and a new way of thinking. Um, but also wanted to thank, obviously, the Care Lab, because none of this would be possible without that amazing team. So thank you. And I didn't realize, having not been in school for a while, I didn't realize it was graduation season. So for everyone graduating, congratulations. Everyone watching the video later, hope it was an amazing day. You'll never forget it. I still remember mine. But with that, let's dive in. So quick agenda, just overview what we're going to talk about. So as advertised, I'll talk a bit about what is ATT&CK. I'll try to make it interesting with some demos, some questions, keep you guys engaged with, some audience participation and whatnot. And then, like I said before, building on top of what Matan talked about, we'll talk about how ransomware is reflected in ATT&CK and kind of how that, hopefully I'll show the value of ATT&CK through the lens of ransomware and kind of how, one of the things I'll be talking about today is why, so much of the community uses ATT&CK to solve and kind of help contextualize cyber problems. So kind of connecting the dots there. And then towards the end, I'll give just a little bit of advice and kind of, hopefully wisdom and another, opportunity for a little bit of an exercise about using ATT&CK. So how do actually get your hands dirty and start to use the framework? And then finally, at the end, I'll keep an eye on the clock and make sure we have, 5-10 minutes for discussion questions. But that said, if you see me looking to the left, I have a monitor here where I'm like reading the slide or kind of, figuring out what I'm saying. But the thing I have right in front of me is chat. So feel free to drop any questions in throughout the entire time. You're probably not going to, don't worry about interrupting. I'll just kind of address things as they come in. Or to be completely honest, feel free to just kind of chime in, talk, turn on your video, whatever. I just want to make sure everyone knows, don't be shy about asking stuff. So before we talk about ATT&CK, I think it's just kind of a opportunity to maybe get some juices flowing. I'm going to take a sip of coffee real quick, but I want to hear from you. Drop it in the chat or feel free to kind of unmute and talk. But based on what Matan said and kind of what you already know, how would you like if you were a consultant or hired to do a job or someone asked you advice, how would you say, based on what you kind of understand so far about ransomware, how would you describe how we stop ransomware or any ideas for how do we kind of start to chip away at this problem and make it something that doesn't exist anymore? So like I said, feel free to drop it in the chat or, I'm going to mute for a second, drink some coffee, but and I'll start reading ideas as they come in. But, just how would you, if you had keys to the kingdom and kind of had the ability to kind of start telling people what to do, how would you start to think about stopping ransomware? Oh, it's a good coffee. Okay, I see a comment from Colt. Cybersecurity education. Andrew saying strong security policies in place. Sorry, chat's going crazy. And continuing education. Try to kill it before we get widespread lateral movement. Regular distributed backups and automated rebuilding. Recognize the signs of ransomware. Education about human element. Training to recognize phishing emails. Strong passwords. Manage internet access. Create backups. Strong network segmentation. Okay, so that was perfect. Thanks, everyone. And, feel free to keep dropping them in there. I think there's all really great ideas. And I think the answer to that question is yes. Everything you said is spot on. I think that's one of the big problems we have here is, like Matan was saying, ransomware is one of those interesting problems that changed cyber for a lot of us, because before, ransomware has been around for, I think, a couple decades, but it really hasn't been a widespread issue until recently, or at least more recently, because a bunch of just how much the world has changed. Starting with how much of our lives are connected to technology. Thinking about when I went to elementary school, middle school, we took hand notes, and we did a lot of stuff with crayons and pens and ink and all that fun stuff. And then now I'm like reading about like you guys have like iPads, and the kids are like super tech proficient, which I don't think I really started using a computer until like maybe like high school. um so there's like obviously, and not just school, but like think about like you go to a grocery store, you go to an airport, everywhere you go there's going to be a bunch of underlying all of that infrastructure is computers. So that's one factor, as well as like Matan was saying, cryptocurrency, honestly. Not going to get into a political debate here, but it is a big enabler. The fact that you can basically exchange money anonymously, as you can imagine, that is pretty interesting in this space. But also, the big paradigm flip would be, and I love that. I think Matan highlighted this, was back in the day, we'll call it the day, um, you know, everyone kind of had an understanding of, how interesting they were to hackers. Where, imagine things like, organizations like governments, or, research organizations that were building new, like proprietary, like software, or honestly, like a lot of video game companies. Those are the people that, and the organizations that were most, kind of, I guess, paranoid or cautious about being hacked, because they understood we have something that hackers want. It's data, it's, access to something secret that we have. Where ransomware, over time has really grown and matured into something that it's a very much a shared risk and a shared problem, in the sense that, those same organizations are being targeted by ransomware because, like Matan said, the people doing, doing these and executing these breaches understand they can get a lot of money, being able to shut down a company like Tesla, or being able to shut down McDonald's, or one of these big organizations. They know asking for a couple million, even up to hundreds of millions of dollars, those companies can't afford to not operate. So it's worth, they have the checks, they have the bank accounts to pay off those big ransoms. But unfortunately, these actors have also figured out that schools and hospitals and retail industry and banks are also in that same boat, and they might not be able to pay as much. But one of the in the last couple of years, the biggest waves of big ransomware attacks we've seen have been targeting those most vulnerable organizations. Thinking out a hospital. Imagine all of a sudden the computers don't work, the nurses can't log all the information, doctors can't do what they do. There's going to be a lot of lives at risk, and these actors shamelessly know that, and they're exploiting it. So it's kind of been an interesting shift from cybersecurity being a problem of a very select few, to something where across the board, if you have computers and you have something connected to the internet, it's definitely, ransomware is now on the radar, and something that we're all kind of thinking about. So I think that's why I'm particularly very excited about this competition. And as I was saying before, getting more folks involved with understanding this problem. And exactly to your very awesome feedback about how do we stop ransomware, really starting to understand all of the ideas and all the potential we could have to actually make an impact here. Because as I said before, everything you dropped in chat is exactly right. It's not going to be one solution, it's going to be many. So the more we can spread awareness about this, the better we all are. So long rant over, sorry about that. So what is ATT&CK? That was supposed to be the big thing here today. And ATT&CK, at the big picture, ATT&CK is a model and a framework that we use to answer that question about how do we stop ransomware, as well as many other cyber questions. How do we stop adversaries stealing my data? How do I stop my users from clicking on emails that they get that have malicious malware or things that could harm us? But so the way we kind of address that problem, and I'll talk about this in depth and obviously do a demo, is exactly as Matan was saying. One of the premises of ATT&CK is the best way to defend yourself is to understand how your opponent thinks and how they operate. So really at its core, attack is very much focused on, let's get in the mind of an adversary. Let's really see the other side and start to think about how do hackers do what they do? Why do they do the things they do? How do they do the things they do? And then we can use that now that we can kind of see, the world through their lens. We can start to pick all those data points and say, when they're doing this, maybe we can try this other thing that defends this. And over here, where they're doing that, we can, try this and that. And slowly we can build and kind of, start to aggregate a bunch of really good ideas, as you did in the chat, that, organizations should use to stop these breaches. So, the way this all kind of came together is attack is going to be a framework of exactly as I said, adversary behaviors. What are they doing? Why are they doing it? And we use this to kind of, like I said, flip that mirror and say, as defenders, now that I can see the playbook and I can kind of see the cheat sheet of how adversaries think, I can start to, pick them apart and say, over here, this is why we need to do these things. I need to hire people to do this to affect these other behaviors. And, one of my favorite things about attack is we don't just sit around and, make these things up. We don't just get a whiteboard or get a piece of paper and draw out like what we think an adversary could do. Almost regularly, like every day, I would say we have a pretty big team, as well as, amazing people in the community that send us these ideas. We read about what real adversaries are doing. So, something like, Matan mentioned, he was the lead of the cyber threat intelligence team for his company. A bunch of organizations like that, as they're responding to incidents and breaches, or as they're tracking actors, they'll publish their findings and say, we caught this group, we'll call them APT or Advanced Persistent Threat number 1 or something. They all come up with their creative names, but they'll track those folks and say, we caught them trying to target a hospital. We caught them trying to steal data from this government organization. And this is, how they did it. Here's the tools they used. Here's the commands they ran. They went to the building and tried to steal, data from their dumpsters, or they tried to break in the door, or, through the internet, they were doing this and that. Basically, what we do is we read all that and we build it into a framework where we can see, what that actor is doing and things that have been associated with that particular group, as well as we can compare it to other groups and other malware and kind of build this ecosystem of just think of it like almost like a dictionary or an encyclopedia of what real adversaries are actually doing. And, as I said, that's my favorite thing. My actual favorite thing about attack is it is all globally accessible and free. So there's no, there's not a thing you have to buy. It's not something you really have to, even sign up for. That URL at the bottom, attack.mida.org. If you go there, it's all there. So, we spend a lot of time and I'll demo this in a minute and kind of show you all the, all the different, bells and whistles on the site. But we spend a pretty substantial amount of time every day, learning new things and kind of drafting content and reviewing it. And then twice a year, we publish all of that so that, you, the community, can kind of, not only use it, but since it's something that's globally accessible and kind of free, honestly, we get a lot of really amazing researchers and other people in the community that send us ideas and send us feedback. So Lex and I have a really fun job of, kind of just learning from anyone and everyone who is operating, kind of doing stuff in this space. So before I go to the site and do a full kind of walkthrough, just to orient you, I know I used a lot of very vague potential terms. So, I'll start getting more specific as we can actually look at attack. But this is the typical view. When we talk about attack, this is typically the way you'll see it visualized. This is what we call, Rachel mentioned a couple of times earlier, the matrix. It's not, if you're a math major, sorry, this actually isn't a technical matrix, but we call it a matrix anyways. So just kind of orient you, we're looking at, it's basically for, just fun trivia fact, attack started as an Excel spreadsheet. So you can kind of see where it didn't really go very far from an Excel spreadsheet, but across the top, that blue banner, the first, I believe that's a row. Yep. That first row, those are what we call tactics. So those are going to be an adversary's goal. Basically, why are they doing something? And you might recognize some of those terms from Matan's talk. So are they trying to do reconnaissance about a target? Are they trying to get initial access to a target? Are they executing something in the target's environment? Are they stealing credentials? Are they moving laterally? Are they, trying to collect and exfiltrate data? All those terms are going to be just big, high level, goals an adversary might have during a campaign. So you can kind of recognize how a lot of those are going to be very adversarial or very red team kind of offensive. Yeah, I got a big Matrix fan in the chat. Awesome. Yeah, sorry about that. I think a technical matrix is, if I remember correctly, it's got to be the same width as length. I think it has to be like a square or something. So technically, it's not a matrix, but whatever. Tactics across the top are going to be those goals. What makes attack really unique, especially there's other frameworks that have that kind of, we'll call it like a kill chain, like adversary does this and this and this and this. What makes attack unique is coming down from that first row, those goals, we have what we call techniques. Those are basically going to be how an adversary would achieve those goals. So if you look at the third column, initial access, we can see, basically the goal here is an adversary is trying to get their first step into your environment. So, they're outside and they want to get in. And there's various different ways they could go about that. So that second row, we can see drive by compromise. They might, that particular technique is they might plant something malicious on a website or a forum or somewhere they think you're going to go. And then they'll wait for you to go to that website or click that link and have it download into your environment. So that's one technique. Second technique would be exploit public-facing application. That is, I think Matan described this as well. They've scanned your, say you're a company, they've scanned your web servers, they've scanned everything you have on the internet, and they found a bug. And through that bug, they're able to exploit it and kind of, go through that server or go through whatever you have on the internet and, basically swim into your environment. You had something that, was sharing a website or an email server or something that was, providing a service for users. And unfortunately, they were able to abuse it and kind of get into your environment. I'm not going to go through all the techniques in that column, but you start to get the gist where we're kind of, at the high level, we have a goal, like what am I trying to do? And then the technique would be, well, how am I actually going to do it? And you can kind of start to see as we work our way down, we're getting more and more specific. So we have tactics are going to be those goals, why. Techniques are going to be those hows, like what are they actually doing? And then, you might have, if you're familiar with like offensive security and red teaming, you might have recognized the term TTPs, tactic, techniques, and procedures. Attack follows that exact same pattern where, a final step of attack is going to be those procedures. And this is what an adversary actually did. This will make a little more sense in a second when we go on a demo, but procedures are basically specific implementations of a technique. So a good example of that would be, going back to our initial access tactic and the drive by compromise technique, the way I would execute that. So, I would put, a certain type of payload on a certain, certain website or something might be different than the way that, Dr. Rege or Matan or Lex or Rachel, we all might do that technique a little bit different. And all those differences and those variations are going to be those procedures. And that's really what's going to separate as we track these groups and these like malicious malware. That's really what's going to separate those and help us really understand, they're all kind of doing effectively the same thing, but they all have their own flavor and their own style to it. And over time, they may change where, an actor 2 years ago liked to do this very particular way. And since that time, they learned things, they changed things, they got caught, the people came into the group, people left, and they might change that procedure. But one of the big premises of attack is, we can start to understand and track these adversaries because these behaviors, as we work our way, in the inverse, like I talked about tactics, techniques, and procedures, as we work our way in the inverse of that, we're going to see less and less change as we work our way from procedures to techniques to tactics, where, like I said, procedures can be pretty dynamic, where the way I do something one day would maybe different than tomorrow, and the way you do it may be different than the way I did it. Techniques, a little bit more brittle, where, if we sat down and thought about it, we can probably think about most ways an adversary would do drive-by compromise. There's a lot of variations, but there's really only so many, and they all kind of have a lot in common. Whereas we work our way up to the next level, tactics, that's not really gonna change very often. Initial access is initial access. Having that goal is something that a lot of adversaries may share, and whether they're changing their procedures, their techniques, initial access is still a goal they're going to have. So as defenders, we can take advantage of that because I know these effectively are the things that an adversary are going to do. So if I can start to defend each of these and understand, hey, what am I doing about initial access? What am I doing about execution? What am I doing about reconnaissance? What am I doing about this? That's going to start going back to my first question, start to add a lot of rich detail and a lot of really good questions to how do I stop ransomware? Because honestly, in this industry, asking the right questions is very often as valuable as having answers, because it all kind of starts with that question. So as promised, let me see if I can pull this off. I'm going to take you on a quick demo of ATT&CK's website. Let me get the screen share going again. Ta-da. Sweet. Okay. So as promised, if you go to attack.mida.org, you'll hit this web page. There's some really great resources, high-level overview of what is ATT&CK, good words there. We have a getting started guide, which is kind of walks you through, if this is your first time looking at ATT&CK, here's some ideas and kind of just like introduction. I do recommend, checking that out and at least skimming it. But hopefully through today, I will save you some time and introduce a lot of that, because honestly, a lot of that is going to be exactly what I just said. But there's definitely a lot of good resources, so feel free to dive in. You'll also, if you're curious, if you go to this tab, ATT&CKCon, you'll see the 2 times Dr. Rege and Rachel presented at our conference. So really great talks there. But yeah, so if you go to ATT&CK, like I said, you'll get to this matrix view, and now we have hyperlinks. You can kind of start to see where this framework actually starts to take life. So if you click on any of these tactics, you'll we'll talk about initial access again. You'll go to this page and kind of describes in more detail, probably better than I did, what is initial access. You'll get obviously, kind of an outline there, as well as here are all the techniques that are in initial access. But fun thing is, if you go out back to here, you can click on, I'll talk about drive-by compromise again. So if you click on that, you'll get a full page here. And this is, as I said before, this is something that we maintain and work to update over time. So, that these techniques are more than just the name. The name is here. We also provide an ID. So if you wanted to tag, in a report, or if you were doing like a red team activity, or you were reading something and you wanted to just quickly highlight it and say, oh, this is drive-by compromise, you could use this ID, and it's in the URL as well. And people will know hey, T1189, this person's tagging it as drive-by compromise, because words are long and hard, so numbers are better. So we have, the name, an ID, description. So we spend a lot of time writing the descriptions so that, you don't really necessarily have to have a computer engineering or computer science or a full cybersecurity background. Hopefully you can read this and kind of understand, what is drive-by compromise? What are the nuances of the behavior? What are some things that are interesting that I should know about as I kind of start to think about defending this? So description here, as I said before, so we have the tactic is initial access, technique is drive-by compromise. This is one of my favorite things about ATT&CK is these procedure examples. These are fascinating. These are real groups and real malware that have used this technique. So you can see APT numbers, names created by, cyber threat intelligence teams. And we put a little description of how they, actually executed this technique, and as well as links to where you can read more about how they did it. So you can kind of scroll through and, see both the similarities and how different actors have done it, as well as the differences. So that's interesting. And then, as I said before, bigger picture is we're not just creating this giant, I guess, website of adversary and red team and offensive ideas. Uh, this is the part of attack that Lex leads. This is, the so what? What are we going to do about it side? So mitigations are going to be, how do we stop, drive-by compromise from being successful? What can we do as defenders from stopping this from being a reality? And then detections at the bottom here is going to be, you know, you can't stop everything. It's a reality. Some of this stuff, works. Some of this stuff may stop like some procedures, and maybe there's others that don't get stopped by this, or maybe these are things that every organization can't do. I would love to leave my front door locked all the time. I bet it would, prevent if anyone wanted to ever break into my house. Having the front door locked all the time would absolutely work. But unfortunately, the reality is, hey, I need to open that door every once in a while. I order Uber Eats or I leave or things happen and I need to unlock the door. So, the reality is sometimes techniques happen. So we have this idea of detection where, when it actually does happen, how do we see it? How do we identify it? And how do I recognize that I have something that I need to respond to? So this is that, defensive side of attack at the bottom here. So as you can imagine, this is a lot of work because you can kind of see here, there are a lot of techniques. I think there's 14 tactics across, and I think there's like 500 something techniques. So it's a lot of work. But also one thing I wanted to show you before I go back to the slide deck is if you click on any of these groups or software, those also have their own pages. So we'll go to Bad Rabbit because that's a funny name. So same thing as techniques, these pages for groups and software also have a full description. So we can read about this thing, Bad Rabbit. It looks like it's malware. Similar to techniques, they also have their own IDs. So in this case, it'll be S0606. That's awesome. Didn't know that going in here, but you can kind of read about it. What is Bad Rabbit? So this looks like, oh, funny enough, ransomware that affected the Ukrainian transportation sector. So I'm assuming like rails and buses and stuff. Um, Interesting. Bad Rabbit has also targeted organizations and consumers in Russia. So interesting flavor there. So we have targeting Ukraine and Russia, some kind of self-propagating ransomware. And we pivoted here from drive-by compromise, but we'll also, from these pages, you can see what else has Bad Rabbit done. They've done some, this one, brute force password spraying. So once they get credentials, they've just kind of tried to log into everything and see what happens. That makes sense because it's self-propagating. They've exploited things, they've corrupted things, they've executed they've done that. And funny enough, ooh, interesting, I didn't know that. You can also, I mentioned the procedures here are groups and software. So I pivoted to a software, but towards the bottom here, we can also see what group has used this. And I know what that group is. Super interesting. Funny enough, this is the Russian government. Did not know that's where we're going today, but as you can imagine, attack is kind of full of mysteries and fun adventures. So this group, Sandworm team, same thing as software and techniques. They have an ID, G0034. As you can see, there's a lot of organizations tracking these folks under different names. So you get to kind of see all this is kind of a good brief, introduction into what the public cyber threat intelligence world looks like. So different shops and different CTI teams are tracking them under different names. We try to do our best to bring it together and say, all of these are, they're talking about more or less the same people. In this case, a part of the Russian government, very particular, actually, Russian military, interesting enough. And these folks not only were targeting the Ukrainian transportation sector, but looks like they were also, targeting like the 2017 French presidential campaign, the Olympics. Oh, and NotPetya, that's a fun one. They basically targeted the entire Ukrainian electric companies. I think NotPetya was like a worldwide thing. They were wiping and destroying a bunch of computers around the world. But as you can start to see, you can, as you dive in, you can start to really get appreciation for everything these folks do. Looks like it's a lot. And they use a lot of malware. So procedures, here's all the malware, and every one of those is going to be a rabbit hole of more and more information. So yep, hopefully that was, like I said, the URL is in the slide deck, and I'll share the slide deck later if you want to kind of go back through it at your own time. But biggest picture, or I guess point I'm trying to make here is tactics, why an adversary does something, how they achieve that goal, techniques, and then you dive in and you see procedures. And this is like the real world, real adversaries doing this. And we connect that to defenses. So the big, what are we going to do about it? Let me get back to slides. Yes, Ryan's question. Governments absolutely use malware during war. It's kind of interesting. So if you watch like a lot of geopolitical happenings, governments for the most part are pretty much in a constant state of trying to steal information from each other. But most governments won't classify that as an act of war. Most of the time, a lot of the war activities would be more destructive. So actually getting something closer to ransomware, where rather than calling it espionage, which is just like stealing information and kind of getting ahead of each other, we'll call like something like ransomware, and like I showed like NotPetya, we'll call those attacks because those are actual, they're destroying systems, they're shutting down industries, they're turning off hospitals. In the case of what we're looking at with Sandworm team, they were shutting down electric grids, they were targeting, presidential campaigns, and those are going to be more classified as active war, which a lot of times they're using a lot of the same, potential skill sets and a lot of the same, even potentially the same, tools that they were using for espionage. So that's a really good question. But yeah, that's one of the things too, is why ransomware is so imminent, is because typically when you think about like cyber war, you think about like governments against each other. Whereas ransomware, like Matan was saying, is going to be adding a criminal element to behaviors that we would otherwise call hostile acts in terms of war. So that's why like, ransomware is kind of at the tip of a lot of defenders and experts' tongue in terms of priority, because it really is, we went from, how many countries in the world, conducting war against each other, versus now almost anyone and everyone can kind of get into that same arena of doing very destructive activities. Great question. So one thing that I did not mention, I was showing you what we call attack for enterprise, and that's what I lead. That's on the left here, and that's going to be, behaviors and those tactics and techniques and procedures that we consider kind of targeting the traditional information technology. So things like Windows, like, whatever operating system your computer is using, think like targeting Windows or Mac OS or Linux, or, routers, your, kind of things that we recognize would be like in a traditional company network. We also have separate, matrix, the same setup, tactics, techniques, and procedures, but, for what we call mobile. So that'll be like, these same actors or different actors also will target your cell phone. So whether you have Android or iOS or Windows Phone, or I don't think Windows Phone is a thing anymore, but whether you have like a traditional like handheld cell phone, these same actors will do a lot of operations or similar operations targeting those. As well as on the far right, we have attack for ICS, and that's going to be, ICS are going to be industrial control systems. Those are going to be things like, the giant manufacturing plants and HVAC systems, and things that necessarily aren't, consumer devices, but more, things that keep the lights on. So thinking about like, your electric grid and nuclear plants, those are going to be, to your question, Ryan, those are typically going to be more government or in the general attack, with the sense of like warfare based operations, since, the sensitivity of those systems, not a lot of people are going to be targeting an electric grid. That's really complicated. It's going to take a lot of work to figure out how to do that. So why you go about that might be a little different than trying to just, make money and steal data. So one of the big things that I think Baton touched on this, but one of the big principles of attack is very often when you read about, cyber activity or all these happenings, you get headlines. So like, for example, you'll in the world of ransomware, you'll hear about, hey, ransomware actors breached some hospital or some company. They encrypted all the data in the environment, and the company had to either pay a big amount of money, or they had to try to figure out a way of restoring that from backups, or they just had to tear their network, cut their losses and start over. We have a technique for that. I didn't show it, but T1486, dated encrypted for impact. So if you go to that technique, and we'll do that in a second, you'll see we do have a technique for, as the name says, encrypting data for the goal of impact. So I want to affect, this victim system's ability to operate by making its data inaccessible. But one of the powerful things about attack is that when you think about, like I said before, you think about what an adversary does and all the things that go into how they do what they do. There's no adversary is just going to do that. You can't just like from 0 to 100 just start encrypting data. There's going to be a lot of steps that go into everything they did before that point, and maybe even after that point. So like I said before about asking good questions, exactly as the slide says, one of the first things, and I love, the feedback you gave in the chat about how do we stop ransomware. Some of that is particularly about this technique. So there's, I'll go to the site in a second, but there's going to be some things that you folks mentioned that are exactly, Lex's team tagged on that technique. So there's some data encrypted for impact specific defenses and mitigations that are just focused on stopping encryption in our environment and being able to restore from that. But there's also a lot of stuff that we can do before that point to prevent adversaries from even getting there. So a good analogy I always think of is like, say I have, think about robbing a bank. Obviously, if you want to I want to prevent that from happening. First step is, hey, obviously I want to put a safe, wherever the money's being, stored, I want to put, a lock or put it in a safe or something. But that said, that's not the end of the story. I could just do that, but I also probably want to, why don't I put a lock on the door? Why don't I put cameras? Thinking about those like James Bond movies and whatnot. Why don't I do like lasers or sharks or some kind of crazy concoction of like building just a nightmare for a robber to get through? I can hire security guards. I can, there's all a bunch of stuff I can do. But really, I can only start doing that if I start asking those questions and really start to understand, hey, how would someone rob a bank? How would they get from outside the bank to the safe and where the money is? And if I can understand that flow, I can start to cherry pick. Okay, at this point I want to do this. At this point I want to do that. So one more field trip. Let me get back to. And voila. So I was mostly talking about this side of the matrix. I was talking about data encrypted for impact. That's going to be over here on the far right. So impact, this tactic, the goal is basically, as the name says, I want to affect the victim, whether it's the integrity of their data or the availability of their data. I want to impact their ability to do what they do. I want to, cause disruption to their business. So if we click on T1486, same thing. We have a description here, ID under impact. This is going to be a good place. You'll see groups and software and the various actors. I think, where is it? Revel. So that was what Matan was talking about. So you can kind of see, yeah, they got a lot of links of them doing this, unfortunately. But, and you can see toward the bottom, we have some detection. So how you potentially would see this happening in your environment, some mitigations, a couple you mentioned, data backup. So great job. So yep. And this is just that one technique that represents that one behavior of there's data that the company needs. I'm going to encrypt it. And then basically, in some cases, I'm going, an actor may hold them ransom, but we've also, getting back to the sandworm team and your question, Ryan, We've also seen adversaries do this with no intention of ever releasing it. So something like we would typically call that more of a wiper. So it's, they're destroying the data and, they might have locked it and threw away the key. They don't, it's more, the effect here is to just kind of, make the system unusable and, basically just cause chaos. So before I go back to the slide deck, I know during Matan's talk, I was digging up some stuff. So, he was mentioning like indictments and raids. So I'll share this later in the link or in the chat, but you can go online. This is one of my favorite things to do on Twitter. There's a bunch of really great Twitter bots that will tweet, these folks, when they ransom, an organization, they'll post it online and in the dark web. And then people will kind of like, oh, like, such and such got ransomed. All of this is something that we can track and kind of follow. We can also follow justice. So in this case, this is the Ukrainian police raiding the Klop ransomware gang. So as you can see, they went full Texas Chainsaw Massacre with a chainsaw to the door. I think it's like a 2-minute video. It's actually super interesting, but just some highlights. They went through, these folks had like, these dark, small rooms where they were, doing the operations on these like huge computers. They had shoe boxes full of just like US currency, and they had a bunch of, various, money from all over the world. Super interesting. But big point here is also they were, they basically the, Interpol or Ukrainian government in this case are seizing all these assets. This is a one that floats around Twitter a lot is, these actors losing their Teslas. They're, obviously confiscating them and taking away. And I think that's the big point of a lot of what we're trying to do with this competition is start to explore how do we go from hospitals being ransomed to this point. How do we use social engineering and other kind of really at the end of the day, we're looking at these these groups and software, just like Rachel, Matan, and Dr. Ege said, there's humans behind here. So how can we start to see through these like big Revil and Conti and all these big names? How can we find the humans behind the keyboard and start to, actually, back to the big question, how do we make ransomware stop? And this is absolutely one way to go about it. Let me get back to slides. I think I'm coming on time here, so I might have to speed up a little bit, but 1 sec, sorry. Button clicks are hard. Okay, awesome. So with that, and I think this is a really good, exactly to that point I was just making, where you can see data encrypted for impact on the right and the dark, we'll call it maroon. That's just one technique in the bigger picture of how ransomware actors actually go about getting to that point. So I just kind of, I read a couple resources and we're highlighting techniques that are very often associated. Honestly, like I said before, each actor can kind of do their own thing and it could look a little different, but just from this notional picture, you can see like how many potential techniques could go into the full campaign of ransomware. So, that on the far right could be the end, that data encrypted for impact. Maybe the last thing they do is encrypt data. But that starts with, looking across all these behaviors. They could do scanning, they could do phishing, they could, like Matan was saying, they could buy your passwords online and then try to log into your systems. They could try to exploit your servers and kind of, like I said before, swim through an email server or a web server and then get into your environment. There's just so much that could potentially go into this campaign that, it's going to help you both see the full breadth of what kind of is possible, but also start to, as I said before, start to appreciate these are all the points where I could potentially stop it in the way. So I loved what Matan was talking about with the ransomware as a service kind of model. And that's honestly why tracking some of these actors is so hard. And like you said before, like I was showing you in that with those procedures and that technique, why it's so, some of those groups and some of those software are honestly pretty hard to track, because this Microsoft published this last week, I believe, really awesome diagram. But as you can see, like, it's kind of, as you talk about what goes in, like what humans go into a ransomware group, there's so much. So, I know Matan mentioned, like, there's the ransomware operator in the top right. They're the ones that maintain, the actual, like, code. They, provide all the services around it. So they're the ones, taking calls and interacting with the victims. And then they have those at the bottom, the affiliates. Those are the ones that are actually, the red team, the attacker. They're the ones that are going, hands on keyboard and actually doing the operations. And then, handing the victims over to the operators, say, hey, we breached them, we encrypted their data, now I'll get the money. There's also another element, because criminals like to, outsource things and, kind of be efficient. These access brokers where, they are, just all day, every day, just finding who can we get access to, whether it's a hospital, whether it's school, whether it's a big company, small company, don't care. They're just trying to get into networks and then sell that to the affiliates and say, look, pay us because we'll sell you access to, McDonald's, or we'll sell you access to this school system or this hospital or this government organization. So there's a bunch of money floating around. And that's why, sometimes tracking these groups gets a little interesting because, it's, whose door do I kick in? How do I find these people? That's where I think a lot of this social engineering overlay starts to play in, because there's, we can see this model, we can see these like little red icons, but how do I actually find the human behind the keyboard? How do I, how can I start to think about how do I get them to reveal themselves so that, governments and police and law enforcement can start to find them? And to that same point, these folks change over time. And I love what Matan said earlier about, they fight, they bicker, they argue about money, they get jealous, they get greedy, they start switching groups and they move around. So this same diagram kind of captures it where, on the far left, we see different groups of these, all those little hacker icons are different groups doing this. And you might see, some of them are just doing access. Some of them are, using different software to just get into environments. And then they might hand that off to another group that actually deploys the ransomware. Some of them might do multiple parts. Some might do one part. They might poach each other's members where, hey, I was a part of ransomware group A, but ransomware group B offered me a higher salary. So I went over there, and, they switch and change, and over time they, learn new things. They get raided, and maybe the group dissolves and they reform under a new name. It's just kind of a wild mess. But I think that's why we're so eager about having more and more folks not only educated about this, but invested and interested in making it, hopefully someday we can figure out a solution to this problem, or at least baby steps into making things better. So that was my spiel on what is attack and, how ransomware is an attack. Now I'm going to finish up with, guidance on using attack. So as a first piece of advice is, as I showed you, attack is huge. Definitely don't think it's something where you're going to learn every technique and every group and every software and every mitigation detection. Start small. Just kind of, think about what you need. You'll kind of work your way through and start to learn things. And over time, you'll start to get really comfortable with, particular things that fit whatever you're doing. Because, attack, I always like to say attack isn't something that's going to solve your problems. It's going to make you better at doing whatever it is you're doing, because it's going to help you define a common language in a way that actually, you can describe what you're seeing or what you're doing a lot better and track that over time. And, second bullet point is attack is growing. Like I said, twice a year, we update it. We add new techniques, we add new groups, we add new software. So if you're looking for something and you can't find it, definitely don't be shy about adding it. It's not necessarily something where if you think of something and it's not an attack, you're not wrong. You just might have thought of something or came across something that we haven't seen yet. And then, final guidance I want to talk about here is actually, part of your reporting for this competition is going to be, documenting things in the language of attack. So one of the best skills, especially, going forward into the rest of your cybersecurity career or anything in kind of in the space of kind of tracking cybersecurity behaviors, is going to be being able to look at a behavior and map that into attack. So as I said before, like being able to say, hey, like adversary did this, how do I tag that in the language of attack? So as you can imagine, it's very similar to the structural attack, where you can start to think about, why would an adversary do that? That will kind of help you identify the tactic. How did they do it? That might help you identify the technique. And then, exactly modeling attack, start to think about, well, how would I stop that? How would I, prevent that from happening? That would be a mitigation. How would I see it happening? That'd be a detection. And then who's doing it? That will help you identify that group or software. I'll skip this one for now because I basically just described it, but we do have some training, and I'll share these slides so you get these links, but we do have some training describing the process I just described. But basically it's, find the tactic, find the technique, and, search for attacker. Feel free to add something. And then final thing I wanted to highlight there is mapping to attack is very subjective. Everyone kind of does it a little differently. So don't be shy about asking questions, sharing notes, and correcting and kind of improving your mappings over time. So just for a quick exercise, I think we can use like 1 or 2 minutes here. I put this paragraph together. I don't want you to try to map this to attack, but the first step of mapping something to attack is going to be finding those behaviors, and then from those behaviors you can map them into the tactics and techniques. So real quick, I'm gonna take a sip of coffee, but just read that paragraph and just think about how many behaviors do you see. So I wrote this. It's basically just a very short ransomware overview of like a hypothetical campaign. Just out of curiosity, drop it in the chat or just think about it. How many behaviors do you see in those 2 sentences? Ah, nice. Okay, so I'm seeing 6, depending on how you count, 5-ish. That was just about where I was. So after I wrote this, I reread it. I went with 6 plus. Those were the exploiting a vulnerability, establishing connections, searching for or accessing a new computer, deploying ransomware, which would be kind of like bring it into the environment, and then finally that ransomware encrypting all the company's data. I counted that as 6, but to be completely honest, you could probably decompose each of those as you ask better questions and say, well, how do they exploit the vulnerability? How did they establish a connection? Those could break out into multiple techniques themselves or multiple behaviors. So, I mean, there's at least 6 here, but to be completely honest, anything above 0, it was a correct answer. There's definitely, how we dig into this scenario and what we kind of find could very well be based on, you being able to ask the right questions. So thank you both for sharing. And like I said, I'll share these slides as well if people want to dive in later. But just some tips about going through this process. I'm a big fan of, I always say, spot the verb. In that case, you can kind of see just finding the verbs here will help you identify the behaviors. And one of the things about mapping to attack is some of these will map to particular techniques. Some of the stuff you read here, honestly, would just map to a tactic. So like establishing connection in we'll call it orange. The third line, I would probably map that to the C2 tactic. That's too broad to be a technique, but that's okay. That's a really good mapping. I could ask questions about, what did this command and control channel look like? How did they establish that connection? But if that data is not available, it's still a good mapping to say, I do see them establishing command and control. And to that third bullet point, you're not always going to have perfect inputs. You're not always going to have perfect intel to tell you all the details about what happened. So you kind of have to learn to work with what you have, ask questions, search, and kind of dig deeper. But at the end of the day, sometimes you just don't have a full story. And that, you'll get these slides later, but DHS put out a really great guide on mapping to attack. It's a bit.ly link, so trust me there. But like I said, you'll get these slides later and be able to get all these URLs. So wrapping up here, like I said before, attack is going to be something that helps you describe these behaviors, helps you tag it, and kind of start to see, both, how do you defend it? What is this behavior? who else is doing it, how are they doing it. But it's definitely, I don't want you to ever think that attack is everything. Definitely, if you ever come across something and you're like, okay, like I don't see it and it's something that I think is valuable, feel free to, just kind of, it's more, attack is more the structure of thinking about tactics and techniques and procedures, vice, the full spectrum of adversary behavior. So adding techniques, adding tactics are 100% in game. So key takeaways, I already kind of touched on this, but attack can help you understand and model those tactics, techniques, and procedures. And by modeling those tactics, techniques, and procedures, you can start to think like an adversary, understand how and why they do the things they do. And then most importantly, what are you going to do about it? As well as, attack is a great learning aid. Even today, I didn't know what Bad Rabbit, I didn't know what that software was. I now know it's ransomware used by the Sandworm team. Just especially, for folks interested in kind of a long, cybersecurity, just this is something you really love, just go to attack and click on stuff and read. There's a lot of really interesting things, a lot of concepts that you might not have been exposed to, or about, and you're like, oh, I didn't realize like that was relevant to these behaviors or these types of defenses or these types of actors. Not going to harp on this too long, but here's some really great resources regarding just cyber relevant ransomware. So, DHS has some great guides, MITRE put out a thing. And I think the last one, there's like a Institute of Security and Technology that has like a stop ransomware task force or something. They have some really great resources there. With that said, I think I have 2 or 3 minutes, so I think we can punt over to a break. Or if anyone has any questions, feel free to chime in now or drop them in chat. I'll be hanging around for the rest of the afternoon, but thank you for your time. I know I talked for 57 minutes, so I definitely don't mind if anyone wants to just run off and get coffee real quick, but thanks again for having me and good luck, everyone.
Thanks so much, Jamie. That was a really great explanation of attack. And I just want to reiterate to everyone how great this resource is for you all. And it's definitely going to come in handy for you during the competition. So with that being said, drop questions in the chat and I'm just going to hand it off to Anshul.
Great, thanks. And yeah, Jamie, this was fantastic. Thank you so much. We connected with Jamie, I think, in the most random way possible, as we did with Matan also. But see, we liked them so much that we wrote them in. We social engineered them into joining us and being a part of this activity. So that was fantastic. Real quick, in 2 minutes, and if you're getting up and stretching, that's fine. I want to take like 1 minute of your time and do a plug for something not related to the competition. So one of the things, one of the newest hats that I've acquired is I serve as the research lead for the social engineering community at DEF CON. So for all of you out there who are interested in research and when you try your hand at social engineering research, please consider submitting a proposal. And I'm going to drop the link into the chat box here. And the deadline for submissions is June 10th, right? So if you want to have a go at it, take a look at it. If you have any questions and you want to reach out to me, you can absolutely do that. I'm happy to take a look at what you've done. And Rachel has been voluntold, as I like to say. So she will be with me at the event. Katora Williams, who's not here with us at this for this orientation, she's also been voluntold to be there. So you'll see friendly faces if you are considering this, right? So yes. And Jamie, you should try your hand at this. I'm serious, because you're scary good social engineer. Fun fact, people, he is really scary good, like scary good.
That is a compliment. Thank you.
That is a compliment. And it's also like crazy. I think Jamie's a social scientist at heart. I'm just going to leave it at that. So it is 4 o'clock. And Matan, I'm going to pass it on to you for a very, very important topic, which students are going to need during this competition.
Yeah, okay, so first, thanks to Jamie. It was super interesting, even as a heavy user of attack, I learned some things. And yeah, use it. It's a good thing. So, Professor, if